So getting on to our great lineup for this morning, we're going to hear from some fantastic women and men who are working to achieve change. Our goal is very simple, but we need to go on the journey together, raising our voices and our sights to advance the women, the ideas and the goals that will drive the next generation of leaders. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome our first panel, the Honourable Mrs. Justice Fidelma Macken, Garda Commissioner Noreen O'Sullivan, Accenture's Reardon, the Master of Holles Street, Dr. Rhona Mahony, Sharon Makuu, the Ireland lead for LinkedIn, and to chair our panel, we're thrilled to welcome back again this year, Keelin Shanley. Thank you.
Welcome and thank you for being here this morning. It's as always, it's really terrific to see just how many people come along to this event. I think it's been really interesting listening to Michelle, looking back at that proclamation, the 1916 time, the rising. There was so much hope, so much inclusion, but as Michelle has pointed out, it really hasn't been easy. Ireland has taken some quite socially conservative steps, and I think women over the last 100 years have been up against it. But I am joined now by 5 women who have not just got over some of the obstacles, some of the difficulties that can be put in place, but have gone on to excel in your fields, to become the leaders in your own fields. So to introduce my panel, because what we're going to do this morning, I suppose, or what I hope we're going to do this morning, is hear a little about how these women have done what they've done, the blocks they might identify to other women following in their footsteps, and together look at what are the next steps. Quite practically, what can we do as women and what can you do as leaders to change events for people who may be starting out in their careers. So just to reintroduce my panel, Noreen O'Sullivan, first ever female commissioner of Garda Síochána, the first commissioner to have been selected also through a public process. At a time of great difficulty for the Garda force. So, a huge achievement, but also a huge challenge to then step into the force. So thank you very much for being here. I know you have a big day ahead of you as well today. And we're also joined now by the Honourable Mrs. Justice Fidelma Macken. Again, hugely successful legal career, the first woman to be appointed as a judge to the European Court of Justice, and also appointed to the Supreme Court here in Ireland. So thank you for being here too.
Thank you.
Now we're at Sharon Makuu. This is a woman who had the courage to take a few years off work, came back from that to work for LinkedIn Ireland with 3 people, and is now heading up LinkedIn Ireland and a team of 900 people. So I think some really interesting advice from your career platform. We're also joined now by Reardon, who is the Global Senior Managing Director of Accenture Life Sciences, a woman originally from West Cork, from Ireland, but has travelled the world really in educating herself and in bringing your leadership skills elsewhere, now based in Hong Kong. And finally, a woman I'm sure many of you will know well, Rhona Mahony, the obstetrician gynecologist, but extraordinarily, I couldn't believe this when I heard it, Rhona, the first ever female master of maternity hospital in Ireland. And I would have to say that the first master in Holles Street who has really got that next step in getting a decent hospital for the women of Ireland. So congratulations on that. Noreen O'Sullivan, I might start with you. You went into Garda Síochána. It's a male-dominated institution. It still is. Mm-hmm. How did you become commissioner? Can you look back at your career and think, that was a key moment for me, or that was a key decision I took?
I think you have to remember, Keelin, maybe the context of Garda Síochána. So women first came into the organisation in 1959. And that might seem a relatively long time ago to some people in the audience, to some others it's more in recent living memory. But in the lead up to the women and the first 12 women that were introduced into the organisation, there were some really interesting Dáil debates, which I think just contextualised the society at the time. And some of the Dáil debates that were held at that time were whether or not women were suitable for the job of policing. And actually a very inspired TD, a member of Parliament at the time, made a comment that he felt that women might be okay, but that they certainly they shouldn't be too good looking, that they shouldn't exactly be horse-faced, but they definitely shouldn't be good looking, and they most certainly shouldn't be targets for marriage. because it might distract the men that would be in the organisation and take away from the job. And I use that as a context because in those Dáil debates of that time, there were some very interesting debates. But those first 12 women were real pioneers, and they made it into the organisation in 1959. But I think we also have to remember that the marriage bar was still in place up until 1978, which meant that right across the civil and public service, if women actually got married, they had to leave and give up their job. And to some people I know in the audience and further afield, that might sound bizarre. So when I joined in Garda Síochána in 1981, it's no surprise I was a tiny minority of women, so less than 1% were women. But women were very conditioned to particular jobs, so mostly jobs to do with women and children and to be on standby. And I remember arriving in Store Street in November 1981, being a very enthusiastic young recruit guard, and I really wanted to get stuck in and do what I felt that the guards do, which was go out and catch bad guys and to do all of the things that I felt good policemen do. And I remember arriving in Store Street to find out that actually the job was very confined, and that was something that I wasn't really prepared for, and actually, quite frankly, I found it very boring. And I also found that my uniform consisted of a skirt, so try scrambling over walls or going along in a skirt, so that was very interesting as well. But I remember at one stage saying, you know, this isn't exactly what I wanted to do, but I didn't know who to talk to. And I was saying, this isn't what I expected. It's not the expectation for the job that I had. And I was wondering, what should I do? But I was very lucky because as I went around Store Street as a young recruit guard, and I'll tell one other story because I think it's, again, I remember being called to a call one night, and I arrived in my full uniform with my radio and my full Garda uniform, and I knocked on the door of this person who was looking for help. And after coming and peeping out the window several times, this man in probably his mid-50s, and he said to me, "Go away, I want a real policeman." And I was sent about my business, so that was great motivation for a young recruit. But I do remember saying, I need to do something here. So I was very fortunate because a small group of us that worked together, we saw that there was a big problem with drugs in the inner city in particular. And I remember we came together, 3 of us, 2 men and myself, and we said, there's something that we can do here. Because actually we're young, there's a different way that we could work. And we came up with an idea that we could actually start working undercover. And we were very fortunate insofar as that we had somebody that listened to us. But the lesson that I learned was it takes a bit of courage to actually think outside of the box and not just to accept the way that things are around here. And it's something I encourage all of our young student Gardaí now to do, to think, is there a better way to do this? Because new people bring new perspectives and a different way of thinking. But also, for people that are at leadership levels in an organisation or even mid-manager levels in an organisation, it's very important that people are open to listening to those ideas and challenging those ideas. We didn't have it easy. Nobody said this is a great idea. Actually, we had to make a really strong case for our idea, and then we were told we better make sure that it works and we don't fail, and that was some motivation as well. So I think for me, one of the very first lessons I learned was not to just accept the way that this is things the way are done around here, to come up with new ideas, but to be constructive in doing that.
It's interesting listening to that. It's almost as if you were somewhat bound by the role of the female guard at that time. So you created a whole new opportunity by yourself. You had to find a way to sidestep it. And I think, Fidelma, that is something you came up against as well at one point, didn't you? You didn't get what you would like to have got, so had to think outside the box.
Yes, I had a slightly more unconventional start to my career because when I left secondary school, I didn't know what I wanted to do. I sort of had a vague idea I might like to be an architect, but I really didn't know what that might involve. So I actually spent 4 years traveling around the world, and that was actually a real education. But when I came back, I knew I wanted to be a lawyer because I had worked for lawyers in the States. And I really set about that in a very focused kind of way. I married very early in college, in my second year in college. And when I finished, I thought, again, not having a clue really what I wanted to do, I had this vague idea of going to the bar, but I thought maybe I'll start as an academic. But I ended up in my last year sitting on the academic council and pretty soon discovered this was definitely not what I wanted. But I fell into my career in a rather unusual way because when I came back from doing my master's in London, I happened to go to a sailing regatta, and I met somebody there who was doing the kind of work that I had been doing every summer when I went to the States. Because when I went to the States, once I went to law school, I didn't work in coffee shops or restaurants where actually you made a lot more money. I really wanted to work for lawyers, and I ended up working for lawyers that specialized in intellectual property. And this man that I suddenly met was actually doing intellectual property. So out of the blue, he said to me, without knowing anything about me, "Would you like a job?" So I went and worked for a firm that specialized in this very esoteric, or at that stage, very esoteric area. And I worked for them for 6 years. And at that stage, I had become a single mother at that stage, and I really needed to know where I was going because I had a 5-year-old daughter at the time. And so I thought, well, the thing I should do is look for a partnership in this firm. I was one of 2 of the most qualified people in the firm. I'd brought in a lot of work. I was very good at what I did, or at least I thought all of these things. And so I went and I asked the partners, what about a partnership? And to a man, because they were all men, they said, "Oh no, we're keeping the partnerships for our sons." You might
No matter how good or bad they were.
You might well be a bit surprised at that. So I thought, okay, I'll go and speak to the font of all knowledge, which was my mother. My father had died at that stage, but I grew up in a household with 2 arch feminists. Both my father and my mother were archly feminist to all of us, and there were 3 boys and 2 girls in the family. And so she said, "Well, look, you've always wanted to go to the bar. Why don't you go to the bar? You can't be any worse off than you are now," which was true. So I went to the bar, but again, when I went to the bar, I was quite ruthless in my approach, or what a lot of people would consider ruthless. I pinpointed the person that I wanted to go and apprentice to. We call it deviling at the bar. And there was one person I really, really wanted to apprentice to. He was very, very good. When I asked somebody to speak for me, because I didn't know him, I didn't have any legal background at all, and he spoke to him, and the man said, yes, if I made a phone call, we could talk about it. But during the phone call, he told me that there was a competitor who had much better legal connections than I ever did, and also much better political connections, because I had none. And so I knew I was really up against some competition. And the normal thing is that the master would invite the person that might go and work for them to lunch. But I turned the tables on him and I invited him to lunch. And I brought along my friend who had devilled for him. And we actually had a very good chat, but I think he was really surprised to be actually asked.
To be taken control of in that way.
Somewhat. Well, I hope it wasn't that obvious. But
I think it might have been Fidelma, and it certainly worked anyway, didn't it? I mean,
worked.
this is, I think, a really interesting idea around women in their careers, is that they don't always take control in that way, that it tends to be kind of a bit more like, oh, that'll suit me now, yeah, I can fit that in with this.
Yeah.
Sharon, is that something you would see in LinkedIn? I mean, I know you had the courage in your own career to step out when you needed to, but you went back in with a very kind of focused plan and idea. But is that something you think that women need to do a little bit more, take a bit more control?
So I definitely think that the women in general can take a lot of control. That said, in LinkedIn we have 50-50 male and female, and so I'm regularly inspired by women taking courage, making career moves, both in terms of out of employment for a while with their children, part-time working. But yeah, definitely I would say there are lots of women who come to me and say, you know, what should I do in this situation? How should I take control? And I regularly advise, you know, taking control of the situation, putting yourself forward, applying for that job. Many people in the audience have probably said to recently, like, apply for the job, put yourself up for that job. Many people say to me, oh, but X, Y, and Z, who's more qualified, are in for the job. And I said, no, everyone has qualifications, so step forward, you know, apply for that job. And me personally, when I took, you mentioned earlier on that I had what I thought was my dream job. I was general manager of business objects in Ireland. I had a fantastic job, fantastic opportunities, and I had 2 small children at home, and I was wondering, you know, how will I juggle, and so I took 3 years off, but it was very much a plan. I took 3 years off, dedicated my time to my children, and then was focused on coming back into the workplace, into a role that I now believe is my dream job here in LinkedIn.
And it was having that focus. You didn't just come back into a workplace and look for a job that you could kind of fit the school runs around or the GAA, whatever, training around. You knew what you wanted and you wanted to go back to where you had been.
Yeah, so when I was off, I did some part-time consulting work for PwC to see whether other industries that interested me. One of the key moments in my own career is that I found the technology industry, and that's something that inspires me. And structurally, there's as many men and women in that industry and a lot of innovation in that industry, so it suits me. But while I was off, I decided to look around and see. So I worked in the pharma industry on a consulting project in retail, but I realized no technology and innovation, that's where I wanted to be. So I very much set about looking for the company
that would
suit me
rather than...
Yes, and at that time, I put down all... I'm a great lady for lists. I put down all of the things that excited me, that I'd been given feedback along my career that where I turned up best, and I wrote my list. And at that same time, LinkedIn was starting in Ireland, and I thought, this is my job. And for 6 months, I followed my role, that is now my role in LinkedIn. It was over three different countries, 15 or 16 interviews, a 6-month process. But that was my job.
To the job you had pinpointed. I mean, again, it's the same thinking, isn't it? It's taking control, not taking no for an answer, and knowing where you're going. Yeah. And I mean, to speak to you, you're based in Hong Kong now. As I say, you're originally from West Cork. You've lived in America along the way as well. But one thing we were speaking about earlier is that we're all going to make mistakes in our careers. We're all going to make mistakes in our lives. But in my experience, women take that harder. Is resilience something that you think we as a gender need to kind of work on a little bit more?
Well, I agree, but I think there's there's deep strength in females in general as well. And maybe it's Irish females in general, but I think there's a strong resilience factor there. And I do think it changes culturally around the world, but in my experiences of working with different women in different cultures, it is that amazing focus. You mentioned the word focus. And there is a driving factor on why they need to do something for themselves. And I find that better in many women than they do in men sometimes. And once you find that, I think the rest is reasonably easy. And when you talk about, mentoring young girls and developing young girls, to me it's really all about self-knowledge. I liked what you said about the fact that, you found the job that suited you. And a lot of it is about really, what are you good at? What would you like to do? And what difference can you make? And once you figure that out, I think the rest is reasonably easy, because you just have to ask the questions. Yes, there's a confidence aspect to asking the questions, but I think people can do it. We are actually running a panel in Hong Kong this week about mistakes in careers and how you actually learned from mistakes with the American Chamber that I'm actually sitting on the women's committee there.
Would you like to admit to any of the mistakes in your career that you've learned from? Maybe share
There are
with
plenty of mistakes I've made in my career, but I think that as we prepared for that session, actually, every single woman agreed that making those mistakes made them stronger. And it changed them to the point that they got over it, they looked at it, they took the lessons learned and said, I won't do that again, I'm going to move forward.
So it's the ability to recover from those mistakes.
Absolutely,
Can be
and that is down to
career.
resilience, but I think the resilience comes from an inner strength, not necessarily from what people can teach you from the outside.
Rhona, Mahony, I mean, to speak to you, it's interesting, the career you have chosen, you would think it would be a female-dominated career, maternity, delivering babies. In fact, like much of the medical profession, it's very male-dominated. You are the first master of Holles Street. Speaking to you just before we came on air, you stepped up to take on that job, because you don't have to do that job. It's an awful lot of extra work on top of your day job, if you like, because you didn't feel anyone else was going to do it right.
Well, I suppose it's first of all, it's a very female-dominated career. Actually, the majority of staff in Holly Street, 80% are females. So, and in fact, almost half of our consultants now are females. So the women are really there, and of course, our patients are women. So it's a very female environment, really. I suppose I became interested in being master. I was working away as an obstetrician. I had just gained my consultant role, but you could see, I suppose, what was coming down the track. We had a third of the number of consultant staff we should have. We knew we were very short of midwives. We had a building that was falling down. We had a very adverse climate in terms of we had a lot of standards to meet, and we had very little resource in terms of funding. We were coming through, a very deep recession that had a huge impact on health sector in terms of money taken out of health and in the moratorium on staff, and that was a blanket moratorium. It's a very blunt tool, and we had all of those difficulty, and I suppose morale a big issue as well. And you sort of think, gosh, we're going to have to really batten down the hatches and hold this together. But you look back in history, I suppose, and Holly Street's been through a few world wars. It's been through all kinds of altercations with the powers that be, but it endures and it survives. And one of the most amazing things is no matter what's happening outside, it's like the Independent Republic of Holly Street. You come in and the babies are being born. And everywhere you look, you know what I mean? The babies are appearing, and it's 25 to 30 every day. And the other fascinating thing is the number of women coming through the hospital in such different circumstances. We have very young women, we have women who are older having their first baby, we have gynecology patients coming. So we have this entire breadth of women. And then we have these babies that leave the hospital every day. 25 to 30 babies leave the hospital every day, and you think to yourself, what will be for them, And they'll go home to a very different environment. Some will be almost smothered with love, and some will have huge expectation to meet, and some nobody will give a damn. Doesn't matter what they do.
And Rhona, can I ask you, I know within the medical profession, there are a huge number of women going into the profession, they're completing the degrees. There's more fall off with female graduates in medicine because it's simply too big a job in many ways. It's a very difficult job to balance.
Yeah.
When you look back on your career, can you see the key choices you made that have brought you to where you are?
Yeah, for sure. One of the very difficult things is for your family. It's one thing you make your decision, and we work long hours, and I suppose, for many years as a registrar, it would be very normal to work up to 100-hour week, and still as consultant now I can do 72-hour call weekends. The hours are very long, you're working all night, you're working all day, and then you've got to come home, and there's really very little left of you sometimes, and your family don't get so much. But the big issues in a medical career are when you have to go away to study, and some of that is mandatory as part of your training scheme. You must travel elsewhere, and when it happened for me, the training schemes had just been invented. I had 3 small children, and it required for me to either bring the kids with me, but they were settled in school. We had a really good childminder who was just fantastic. The children adored her, and she just never let us down. Hail, rain, wind or snow, she was with us. And my husband had a career he had to try and run as well, and he couldn't just up sticks and go. So I was left with the decision, well, do you give up everything? Because it's all or nothing in medicine. If you want to be a consultant, there's no staying at a certain level and just not progressing. It's either you go all the way or that's it. So do you give that up? And they were some of the most really difficult decisions, most difficult for my children and for my family. And you find it's a very lonely place to be in another city, and your children are elsewhere. And there's nothing more lonely than Dublin Airport on a Monday morning at 6 o'clock, and for the men as well. There is a whole subculture of people who leave our city every Monday morning, and they won't get back till Friday, and they're trying to balance these 2 lives, and it's particularly difficult for families.
It kind of brings us on. I'm aware now we're running down the clock here. It's so interesting listening to you talking about your own experiences. But there are 2 ways of looking at it. One, that women need to do things differently, that they need to, become more resilient, become a little bit pushier about themselves, or that the system needs to change. It's probably not either or, it's both. But could I ask you very briefly, what you each would identify, if you were to look at some of those key changes, what would you see you'd like women to do and the system? Say, Nóirín, within the guards and also the female guards you're dealing with.
But within Garda Síochána, we have 26% of women now, and that certainly poses challenges in terms of providing the opportunities, particularly for women, and our women tend to be younger, so particularly for women who decide to have their children, and just picking up on Rhona's point, at a particular time you want to provide those opportunities. But I think equally society is changing, so providing the opportunities for men as well. And I think that's something that we actually have to address in a more thought-out way, in terms of making sure that the opportunity is there for everybody to be the very best that they can. And I think, picking up Alistair's point earlier on, I think it's creating an environment, for me certainly as the Commissioner of Garda Síochána, it's creating an environment when everybody can contribute to the best of their talent, and providing the opportunities for people to do that, irrespective, and picking up again on Sharon's point,
So
of stepping in
that's
or out.
the system, if you like. That's how
Yes.
the system should work. The individual women within it.
I think the individuals, for me, certainly in my experience, and even listening here, it's taking the opportunities and seeking out opportunities, not waiting for somebody to come and hand something out, but to seek out the opportunities and to have that self-belief and that self-awareness, to know what your own strengths are, to know where your own developmental areas are, and to seek out the opportunities to develop in a more rounded way, and I think that's very important.
Okay, so seeking out the opportunities, but also the system does have to facilitate people getting the best they can out of themselves. Fidelma, would you know particular issues you would like to
I think
change?
from a systemic point of view, it's a bit difficult to talk about the bar, or indeed the legal profession, because at the bar everybody is the bar, and everybody is an individual. So there isn't a great deal among the sort of so-called systemic obligations that might arise, as you would find, say, in a big undertaking like the Garda Síochána. But from a personal point of view, and I think probably the very oldest on this panel, and I often look back at things, I think there are two very key things. One is that women and men really have to look at the way they encourage very young children, very young female children, and the attitude that they inculcate into very young girls. I think you can do an enormous amount in terms of building confidence and ability and being fearless about where they want to go, and the openness of going wherever they wish to go. I think that's really probably still, when I look back, the most important characteristic that was given to me by my own family.
And that was your parents that did
Yes,
that, both
most
your mother
definitely.
and your father.
And the other thing I think, and this is something I think all women can do, but again comes from my experience, but in my experience, and what I always encourage the next generation, and now that I see the even next generation beyond that, if you are in a position of mentoring or even supervising people, I think it's enormously important to understand the difference between controlling how they are and encouraging how they actually can let themselves be. And for example, most of the people here are going to be in areas where they know a lot about the areas. They've studied it, they have huge abilities and great competences. But encouraging them in positions that allow them go out with enough information so that when they stand up or when they present something or when they have to solve something, that competence is supplemented by a confidence that you have surrounded them with, so that they can go out and not fall flat on their faces. And I think if you watch people coming through and you allow them exercise their competences and be who they really are, but at the same time make sure that they're not being put into situations where they might have ill-equipped. And once, however, that you do equip them with that ability to stand up and be confident, then I think you can let them fly, because they do have great... I mean, I look at the young people now and I am in awe at their confidence, and competence and ability.
Both of you there would have highlighted the system needs to allow people to achieve the best that they can do.
Yes.
If you, Sharon, could change one thing to make it easier for women to participate more fully in Irish society, what would that be?
I'm going to say two things quickly. The first one is just opening everyone's eyes to the opportunities that are out there. I invited my 12-year-old daughter here today just to see everyone on the stage, and I just think if every child could have that opportunity, what opportunity exists. I would say that's the first thing. And then the second thing, I've been extraordinarily lucky in regard to the mentors that I have met over the course of my career, and so that for something systemic, that for those children who leave Holles Street without someone who doesn't care about them, that could be structurally brought into the dynamic of the education system, mentoring, I would say.
Mentoring. I know the best piece of advice I ever heard was choose your boss wisely. It's true.
Totally.
Anne, what advice would you?
Well, from a perspective, I had the opportunity, as I told you yesterday, to run a panel across the globe. And I think if I could wave a magic wand tomorrow morning, what I would love to challenge is societal stereotyping. If we could just stop stereotyping, males, females, whatever, and allow each of these children who leave the hospital to find what they're really good at. I think there's something for all of us, and there's a role for each of us to play. We just put people in boxes too early. And that's very, very difficult to overcome. But I think that's something...
so ingrained.
It's ingrained in every society in the world. But if you could overturn that and really then have everybody achieve what they are capable of, we would have a much richer society. And frankly, we'd be using our talents better than we are today.
Yeah,
we're sub-optimizing our talents the way we're actually structured at the moment.
With less outcome for society today. We all need parents like Fidelma's by the sounds of it. Rhona, finally, I'm sorry you're at the end of the panel, so I keep coming to you last, but what would you say?
It's all about achieving potential, and for that we need a very robust education system, which is much more just about than the maths and the Irish. We need to be equipping our young people to go and achieve their potential, encouraging them. I think a big difficulty, particularly for young women, is by the time they're 14 or 15, there's such a pressure on them to look beautiful, and they're very conscious of how they look, and perhaps not conscious enough of who they could be. You know, they could be a human rights lawyer, they could be anything if they set their mind to it. And how do we encourage our young people to go up with a sense of contribution as well, with the contribution that they can make to society and the whole...
What they can give,
what they can give rather than all about... I think our society talks a lot about entitlement and what we can get, but what about contribution? There's nothing more satisfying than doing something, actually achieving something and doing something. You know, these are the things that make us tick, I think, as human beings. And so to really get that message out to young people, it's not about how you look, it's about what you're going to do. And I think that's very important. And then later on, we've got to talk about birth. You know, we don't talk enough about childbirth. It's almost as if, like, oh, you know, in a career setting, you can't talk about the fact that women are going to have babies. You know what they are. We get really surprised every year in Holles Street that 25 to 30 midwives have a baby every year. Of course, 25 to 30 midwives have a baby every year. And why are we surprised? But we need to be ready for that. That should not be an issue. And so in our working structures, we need to know there's going to be young families, and men also. And we need to, again, coming away from stereotyping, it's cool for men to mind children. It should be cool for men to be at the school gate collecting kids and, you know, staying at home and looking after children. But all the time we impose this kind of gender stereotype, and there can be a tension between what is in the individual and what they are meant to be, and that can make people very unhappy. So let people be.
Yeah, and encourage them to be the best they possibly can. And say, listen, I could listen to you for hours, but unfortunately we can't. We're going to have to wrap it up there. But thank you all very much indeed for being here this morning and for being so generous in sharing your own experiences with us. Ladies and gentlemen, our panel.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Well done.